We will not give the killer the dignity of uttering his name today, but I will name the terrific panel I've gathered to talk about this. Jonathan Greenblatt is the CEO of the Anti-Defamation League. Tom Friedman is a New York Times op-ed columnist, and David Frum is a senior editor at The Atlantic. Tom Friedman, let me start with you. What is the big takeaway from these two events, particularly the last one, as I said, the synagogue, which just strikes me as a terrible, terrible sign, some kind of a canary in a coal mine?
Well, Fareed, thanks for having me. The framework I look at all of this is, for me, goes back to a column I wrote a week before the election. I quoted one of my teachers, Dov Seidman, who said, we're living in an age of moral arousal. Everyone today is morally aroused. And that moral arousal is a good thing when people are aroused against racism and anti-Semitism and abuse by men to women in the workplace. But when there's no governor on this moral arousal, it can easily lapse into moral outrage. And then you find yourself in a huge storm. And that's where we really are today. Now, where does all this moral arousal come from, Fareed? First, it comes technologically. We live in an age now of social networks where anyone who is morally aroused on any issue can now have a megaphone and express that to the world. And in the incidents this week, we saw that the people who perpetrated both these terrible incidents were using these platforms. What these platforms also do, though, is they give comfort to racists and homophobes and anti-Semites and bigoted people. Bigoted people, Fareed, have never had it more comfortable in America. Because of these social networks, they can find fellow bigoted people to feel really welcome. Secondly, this moral arousal comes from the fact that these people dividing us has actually become a business. We have a network in this country that's in the business of dividing us, okay? We know that. We have politicians who are in the business of dividing us. We have commentators who are getting rich by dividing us. At the same time, we're in an age where political identities are really up for grabs. Who's an American? What bathroom can I use? Who's going to have a job, me or the robot? That also adds to this arousal. And lastly, we have a president whose business model, whose political business model is to divide and create fear, okay? So Trump's actual job description, to be a healer, conflicts with his business model, all right, which is to be a divider. Now, when you have all of this moral arousal, okay, and moral outrage, as Seidman knows, and it doesn't end up in moral conversation, but just ends up in more outrage and arousal, you get this giant storm. Think of what happened this week with Megyn Kelly. I'll stop here. On NBC, she lost her job for making stupid and insensitive statements about blackface. Immediately, it's off with your head. What if we had spent the week telling Megyn Kelly, you need to spend the week on your show in a moral conversation about this issue? Unfortunately, we go from moral arousal to outrage to off with your head. And we have no president, Fareed, who can galvanize the country in a moral conversation about these issues and to engage people, because his business model to create division and fear conflicts with his job description to be a uniter and a healer.
Jonathan Greenblatt, you and I have talked over the years, and you've been pointing out to me for a while, years now, that there has been this extraordinary rise of anti-Semitism in a country, as I say, we thought we had solved this problem.
Right. Well, look, Jews certainly live with tremendous privilege in this country, the likes of which we haven't had in thousands of years of diaspora. But the anti-Semitism that we're seeing explode today has been with us for some time. What's different is that it is now out in the open in a way that defies, morality. So the ADL, we track anti-Semitic incidents. And in 2016, after more than a decade of decline, we saw a 34% increase of acts of harassment, vandalism, and violence. Last year, a 57% spike, the single largest surge we have ever seen in covering this for 40 years. And in fact, just last week, I was with the head of the NYPD Hate Crimes Task Force, who told me that to date in 2018, the number of anti-Semitic hate crimes in New York City is at almost the exact same level as it was a year ago. So what is troubling, what is terrifying, is this seems to be the new normal, as we saw punctuated in such a tragic way yesterday in Pittsburgh.
David Frum, is it fair to talk about the surround, and the political rhetoric, or is that too far? I'm thinking, for example, about the fact that this idea that the Tree of Life or the Jewish groups have been helping people find refuge, perhaps even being involved in this caravan. This claim, I mean, all you have to do is listen to Fox News and you would hear it often repeated. There's a Campbell Soup vice president for government affairs who tweeted about how George Soros was funding this. There was a pro-Trump campaign ad, the last pro-Trump campaign ad, that had 3 very prominent American Jews, Janet Yellen, George Soros, and Lloyd Blankfein, photographs talking about globalism, a conspiracy to deny ordinary Americans their rights. Are these anti-Semitic tropes, or are we stretching too far?
Well, George Soros was, of course, also a target of the bomber who sent the packages through the mail. So George Soros, I think, is very much owed an apology by Fox News, by many Republicans who have created a highly personal level of incitement against him. And I think that example underscores something you said in your very eloquent opening statement. The bombings and the shooting are quite different. And I would direct attention to 2 special ways they're quite different. The first is the targets of the bombing were people who had been individually attacked and denounced by President Trump. And the bomber seems to have been somebody who was quite apolitical until Donald Trump came on the scene. So I think that attempted crime, those crimes, are very attributable to the president. His incitement has quite a direct connection to the attempt on these dozen bomb attempts. Unlike the shooter, who seems to have been reacting to a much more generalized level of anti-Semitism that we've been discussing already. And as said, the Trump administration and others have dog-whistled about Jews. They have not been as directly inciting as they were against the targets of the bombers. But here's the second and even more important difference between the 2. The bomber sent a dozen packages aimed at a dozen people, and no one was hurt. Because making an effective bomb is quite a technically challenging task. And getting it through, transporting it through the mail, there are many legal obstacles, including the obligation to deliver any package of any size yourself at the post office. And so, thank God, nobody was hurt in those attacks. On the other hand, once you decide to use a firearm as your weapon of murder, then it could not be easier. And we have seen not only in this terrible attack in Pittsburgh, but in Las Vegas, in Newport, in so many crimes in schools, that really anybody who can easily lay hands on these insanely murderous weapons and kill not one person at a time, but dozens of people at a time.
Tom Friedman, do you think that when we confront this kind of problem, is the answer to speak out, to denounce it? Is it to go and look for more people? I think at some level I look at this now and I'm at a loss as to say, well, what is how do you tone down, how do you make less of this happen?
Well, Fareed, it starts with leadership. Actually, in my career, I've covered the Secretary of State and I covered the President of the United States as a reporter. One thing you notice when you cover the President is the exponential expansion of the megaphone. There's just nothing like the President of the United States. And when you had a policeman confront a black professor in Boston in the Obama presidency, what did Obama do? He invited them for a beer at the White House. There is no single magic cure for this, Fareed. But one thing, I can't tell you what's sufficient, but I know what is necessary. And that is for the President of the United States to show empathy and be someone who demonstrates moral compassion, moral conversation, moral engagement by what he does and what he says. Not to say, let's just get this bomb stuff out of the way so I can actually go back and keep the country focused on the fact that there's a caravan of refugees from Honduras heading our way, and there are Middle Eastern types among them. That was a flat-out, cold, flat-out lie, absent any evidence to the contrary. And what Trump is doing is exactly the opposite. And we cannot run away from that. Of course he didn't order these shootings. Of course he isn't directly responsible. But he's responsible for failing to create the kind of counter context to this. And he's responsible for inspiring people who have these views to feel comfortable sharing them.
And let me add on that Middle East caravan thing. Even if there are Middle Easterners, which, as you said, there's no evidence, it is worth pointing out 99.99% of Middle Easterners are not involved in terrorism, and it's a kind of ugly slur. Jonathan Greenblatt, you've been tracking this particularly with regard to technology. You had a report out this last Friday that talks about how social media actually has, just as Tom Friedman said, encouraged more of this stuff. So what is the solution?
Well, you know, at the ADL, if you're fighting the front line on hate, now today you have to be confronting Facebook and Twitter and Google and YouTube and all the big brands and platforms. We literally opened up a center in Silicon Valley last year. And I think there's two pieces to this puzzle. So number one, we need to be engaging with industry and thinking about not just better policies for the platforms, but better products for the users. And how do we use technology and reimagine the algorithms to take hate speech and get it off of those platforms? Or at least, if you can't remove it entirely, you can turn down the volume to make it far harder to hear and to find. So we need to engage the companies to use the innovation to engineer better products. And then secondly, we need policymakers to get involved. I mean, the law needs to consider new phenomenon like swatting and doxing and cyber stalking and cyber hate, and to identify these as issues that require policy solutions as well. So we need both our policymakers and our product designers to get engaged on fighting the problem.
David, what about this issue, particularly with the Tree of Life Synagogue, which revealed once again this guy had 21 or 22 guns. One of them was an AK-47. This is a military-style assault weapon. Sorry, AR-15, a military-style assault weapon. Is there anything you think that could change the political dynamic in this country? We have actually made it easier in the last 5 years to get guns of this kind.
Well, I have written about this, how since Sandy Hook, the legislative, at the state level, the legislation in favor of guns has become more permissive, and you can now bring guns into bars of all places. But I am optimistic about this question. I think we are going to see with weapons something very like what happened with drunk driving in the 1970s and 80s, which is a cultural revolution is coming. And it is going to be driven, I think, very much by women, by mothers, who are going to, at some point, break through the relatively small number of strategically placed people who make it impossible to have anything like the kind of regulations that other countries have. I spend much of my time in Canada. In Canada, if you want a hunting rifle, you go down to the Canadian Tire and you get a hunting rifle. But what you cannot get is an AR-15. What you cannot get is a Glock, because why on earth do you need an AR-15 or a Glock if what you want to do is hunt duck or deer? That's coming. I am confident of that. And it will begin as a moral revolution, a cultural change, and the legislative part will probably be last.
Tom Friedman, what does it say about the situation in America today that, I can't remember the last Middle Easterner, let alone, foreigner, actor who has perpetrated an act of terrorism in the United States. It's been years now. And what we are now talking about, who would have thought, right? 17 years after 9/11, what we're talking about is not Islamic terrorism, but domestic terrorism being perpetrated in the United States on the basis of politics and religion. And
Fareed, there's a sickness in the country. I grew up in Minnesota in a Jewish community exactly like Squirrel Hill. And my wife grew up in the same kind in Iowa. And it's what has always made me a political optimist and a moderate, because I grew up in a time and place where I saw Jews be fully integrated into American life. And yes, there was anti-Semitism and there were struggles, but nevertheless, I saw politics work. And what is so troubling to me today is we've reached a point where it's not working in the country, where we are the problem, not foreigners. And the problem is very clear, Fareed, and we cannot run away from it. We have a president without shame. He is backed by a party without spine, and they are amplified by a network without integrity. And when you face that kind of triumvirate, there is only one thing to do, and that is to get a lever of power to change it, okay? So there's only one thing to do in this midterm election, and that is vote for a Democrat. I don't have any other solution in the short term.
Jonathan?
Yeah, a few quick thoughts. Number one, we've looked at the ADL at extremist murders in the U.S. In the last 25 years, the vast majority, almost 80%, have been committed by white supremacists, extreme right-wing fanatics. And I'm not afraid to speak truth to power to candidate Trump or President Trump. But I also just want to underscore, this problem is bigger than one person. Whether you're the President of the United States or a university president or the President of the PTA, we expect people in positions of authority or public figures to speak out consistently and clearly when anti-Semitism shows up or other forms of intolerance. And we all in the public and people in the media need to hold them accountable when they don't do that.
David Frum, any last thoughts? We've got about 2 minutes left.
I do note, Jonathan talked about dialing down the volume of the worst noises on social media. President Trump just last week complained that his Twitter was being underserved by the platform, suggesting that whenever he hears people talk in the way that Jonathan just did, he thinks that they're talking about him. That President Trump is not only not going to improve, he is a model of exactly the kind of behavior that is so reprehensible and so upsetting both to Tom and to Jonathan. He's never going to be different. He's never going to be better. I think when we ask questions on TV, what should the president do? We need to start with who and what the president is. He will not improve. He is what he is.
All right, let me thank you all, and let me just, in closing, remind you, it's a terrific quote by that German Lutheran minister whose name I can't remember, but as I recall, it went something like this, and it seems like a week to remind us. First they came for the socialists, and I did not speak out because I was not a socialist. Then they came for the trade unionists, and I did not speak out because I was not a trade unionist. Then they came for the Jews, and I did not speak out because I was not a Jew. And then they came for me, and there was no one left to speak out. When we come back, foreign policy.